some of us, I was, bought in to a certain kind of, well, I would now call it a myth. And I don't mean as in illusory, I mean a myth that one lives by, and which is, you know, a foundational idea. And one of the foundational ideas that I'd picked up during my childhood and schooling was the love of nature, a love of all of this. But the flavor to that love of nature that I'd picked up, because of how it's colored by our culture at this time and at the time that I was growing up, meant it was like a two-sided coin, and that love of nature on the face side of the coin had on the reverse side of the coin a kind of mistrust of humanity as a legitimate force for good in the world. The guests, what they depict is more just the feeling of well-being. So the images look lit up, the figures look lit up from within. I would say now was a self-portrait of how I felt when I started to make those pictures. And that seems to me way more convincing as a true motivation coming out of the guts, not out of the front brain, for what was being depicted at that time. The idea for the technique, so when I was a kid, when I was 13, 14, something like that, I remember going for a walk with a friend, and the pavement was covered in little round dancing light images. And I remember saying to her, that's odd, because that's obviously coming through the leaf canopy, but if you've got round leaves and you put them together, the holes between them always are angular. They're always like triangles or, you know, sort of squares or something. You can't really explain how everything on the ground is circular. And she went off to school the following day and asked her physics teacher, who said, it's because the tree is acting like a pinhole camera. And I was astonished. The idea that the tree was a kind of camera and it was forming images of the sun's disk, some of them in perfect focus, it just stuck in my mind as an amazing phenomenon. How did I end up using that? So that memory was just in the memory bank, not recalled again for the next almost 20 years or something like that. Seeing the solar images on the floor in my home village, Flixton in Manchester, was probably about 1972 or 3 or something like that. And then 20 years later, I had my career more or less at the museum, and I'd started to make artworks. And I was drawing, painting clusters of suns, but in an abstract way, as if it was almost like a galaxy, and just doing these coloured watercolour lines in a kind of cluster, almost like chrysanthemum bloom or something like that. And they were meant to be clusters of stars, really. The idea was very resonant within me. The paintings were okay, but they weren't as powerful as I felt the idea of this solar cluster, and it occurred to me that it would be better to actually use the sun's disk and to create a camera that had like 1,000 lenses. And so I thought about going to the camera shop developers and getting out of their trash some of those throwaway plastic cameras and taking the tiny little cheap plastic lenses and making a kind of array, like a dome of those little lenses, and then imaging the sun, and it would create a solar cluster. Whilst mulling that idea over, suddenly it popped into my head that, a pinhole camera doesn't only have to have one pinhole. A pinhole camera could have 100 pinholes. A pinhole camera could have 1,000 pinholes. And so I went and created a solar cluster on a piece of aluminium foil and put it onto the cardboard box, which we can see, the meteor cooler cardboard box, which I presume is just a carton from some sort of air conditioning unit that I adapted to be a camera. Sure enough, it imaged. I remember going up onto the roof of our flat in London and pointing it at the sunset, and on the back of the camera I could see 1,000 sunsets, beautiful red suns in a cluster. And I knew that if I could record that onto photographic paper, then it was going to be interesting. They were only small images. I mean, the bottom of that meteor cooler cardboard box is only, what, 16 by 20 inches or something like that. They were clusters, solar clusters, like galaxies, like chrysanthemum heads, but they seemed to be illuminated from within. So this was the first camera that I used the colour Chrome on, and highly sophisticated shutter. I was interested in the notion that somehow the world, the planet, was surrounded by a layer of human mental activity. So just the mind, a layer of mentation, as it were, that surrounded the planet. So there are all these old maps of the cosmos where you see Earth, water, air, fire, you know, those kind of old pre-Copernican maps. And I thought, wow, there's another layer around the world, which is the layer of psyche. That's what it was. And I discovered this writer, an archaeologist, Jesuit archaeologist called Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And he called it this layer. He had perceived in the 1920s or 30s this same idea, and he called it the noosphere, the noosphere. We still have the word now for when you say you use your nous, that's where it's coming from nous. And so those solar clusters were meant to be an image of psyche enveloping the planet in a way. The title of that series was "The Earth is Like the Sun." As if the solar system had twin stars. A star shining with the nuclear light of the sun, and a star shining with the psychic light of the Earth. And that's how it started off. So the paintings were my best stab at doing it as a painted version. And because the beauty of it was so powerful to me as I felt it, the paintings were never powerful enough to do justice to the feeling that I had. And so the idea of using the sun itself. Sue and I were driving. I was still doing some art history stuff. So we were in California, and I'd done a lecture at the Getty Museum in LA, and we were driving Route 1 between LA and San Francisco, and suddenly it hit me, this memory from 20 years ago. Pinhole camera with 1,000 pinholes, you know. So it is amazing how, I mean, that arose unbidden from out of the memory banks, hidden for all those years. There was something about the idea that the earth was surrounded by this layer of psyche or soul that was a very general idea. And I guess I wanted at that point to do an individual mind, to show the sort of psychic energy in an individual. Because I mean, that noosphere, the layer of psyche, is made up of millions of human beings. So I just wanted to make one of those. I mean, this is opening up a whole new subject, because what I would say now is that was what I thought I was doing. So that seemed to be the immediate motivation for doing the guest series. And it's kind of convincing to me still. And it was certainly convincing at the time. It felt as if that's where the energy was coming from. So that was in 1993 when I started those. Nowadays, I would say that actually what they depict is less that I've just described, and more just the feeling of well-being. And that seems to me way more convincing as a true motivation for what was being depicted at that time. They're incandescent. There's a sense that there's a sort of physicality there, but that the breeze could blow through it. So you get those brighter suns which seem to be nearer, and you get the less bright suns which seem to be psychologically a little further away. So there's a kind of volume to the figures, but it's not fully material. It's as if the wind could blow through it. And that sense, combined with the idea of it just being lit from within, I think, you know, that's a lightness of being, you know. And I had reached that point, having let myself out of jail, out of a personal jail that I'd been in. When I started the guests, I was very interested in what's called indexicality. So that means where, like when you do a death mask of somebody, or even a life mask out of plaster, you're not creating a sculpture of their face, you are casting their face. So I was very interested in the activity of allowing the shape or the form to create itself in the work. The way that I did that was getting somebody against the sheet of paper and drawing around their shadow, and then transferring the drawing of that shadow onto the very big sheet of aluminium foil, and then carefully pricking the 25,000 apertures. So that's how they started, and then gradually there were people that I dreamt of that I was not familiar with. So, and some people in your dreams are not known to you at all, then I would have to draw them from my imagination. That's kind of where I am nowadays. If I'd make a new photograph now, it's of somebody that I've recently newly dreamt of, or you know, who's known to me, or if it's somebody unknown to me, then I'm inventing the silhouette. I always feel like the glance of the guest figures is down and far away, as if you're lost in thought. So you can see with this one, my head is either thinking it's looking down at somewhere on the ground between us and it, or somewhere beyond. You don't know whether it's my back or my chest that you've got. 3:31 in the afternoon in July 1996. So that's a hot afternoon, a lot of sun. I don't know if we've talked about this, that each of those pinholes images an image of the sun. So the pinhole on the foil that made this little sun on the arm here, but it also saw the whole of the blue sky. And so did this little sun that made this image. It saw the whole of the blue sky. So you're getting 25,000 blue skies layered on top of each other. And that's why the blue is so intense. The width that a pinhole sees, the lens that a pinhole makes, is very, very wide angle. You know, the idea of a personal jail, it sounds like something pretty intense. So it's more like a way of being. One of the foundational ideas that I'd picked up was the love of nature. But the flavor to that love of nature had a misanthropy, a kind of mistrust of humanity. Well, you see it everywhere still. I think the culture is imbued with a love of nature which unconsciously has as its obverse side a hatred almost of humanity. So just to give you an example to make the contrast, and that's a romantic period idea, okay? A previous period of thought, just to make the contrast, in the Renaissance, if you found a beautiful mountain, the pinnacle of that mountain would be incomplete without a temple or without some human edifice of great beauty that would complete nature. Whereas nowadays, you know, you would never think of going to Yosemite and putting a building on the top of the Half Dome. The ethos that we live by is the same ethos as the Sierra Club in California, which the motto is leave nothing but a footprint, take nothing but a photograph, which is a lovely, modest interaction with nature, but it bespeaks a lack of confidence or a lack of love for human creation. It was discovering that there was this weird obverse side to the love of nature coin and swallowing, living that myth. And it's unconscious, you don't realize, but you are living a being in which your humanity is suspect. All our humanity is suspect within that myth. And when I let myself out of jail, it was to realize the nobility of human artifice and the agency of human design in the world that completes and beautifies the world and is not automatically discounted as unnatural. And I got to a point where, I would think to myself, wow, everything's natural, even cities, because there's a woodpecker laughing at the idea. Yes, that a city is the creation of the human animal. The psyche of the human animal, the design, the need to create things is a force of nature. And it's a legitimate force of nature. It's the same force of nature that allows this stream to cut through this ravine here. the creation of a city. So I was going around, wow, you know, the whole world is a phenomenon of nature. And that lasted for a little while until I realized that what I'd done was destroy the polarity. The whole nature culture polarity had kind of evaporated, and what was left was being. It wasn't to say that everything in the world is natural, including cities and whatever. It was that the whole nature culture polarity had gone, and so what was left was just that everything had legitimate being. When that sinks in, when it sunk into me, I felt that I'd sprung myself from jail. And that's why the lightness within those guest figures seems like an appropriate image of how it felt to be at that moment. There's another component to it which is more difficult to talk about. So it legitimated feeling. Coming to that realization legitimated emotion and feeling, but it also legitimated action, so that there was this kind of twin healing. You know, the idea that you could go into nature and create a city and that would be a legitimate phenomenon of nature, because one is part of nature and the design principle of the human mind is part of nature. That let me out of another part of the jail. Suddenly one is a legitimate agency in the world, rather than leaving nothing but a footprint and taking nothing but a photograph. I felt that one could be more of an agent, more active, less modest about one's footprint in the world. It's not a fashionable thought today where we're all needing to be leaving less of a footprint, but it was definitely something which rehabilitated my psyche into a phase of well-being. Not everybody has taken the same moral from the romantic myth that is still operational in the world, but that's what it did to me. I was rehabilitated. On this foil, I've traced the outline of Ed's silhouette. So this is his shadow. Then I do, with a blunt pencil, kind of a heavy line over it, and it impresses itself into the foil. So it's just a normal household pin. I look for the outline and then very gently start to do varying apertures along the line of the silhouette, making sure that some of them are large holes going right in through the full depth of the width of the barrel of the pin, and some are just nicking it. Of course, the first time you make an exposure through one of these, it's just an experiment to see where you messed up, basically. Once the first photo is developed off this foil, then I'll know where to go back into the foil to improve the look of it, basically, make it more convincing as an image. So the back of the foil is just sprayed with car spray paint matte black, so that there's no reflections inside the camera. When you see the first image developed off this, when it gets exposed and then the paper gets developed, you can go back to the foil and add pinholes, or take pinholes away, block them up. You can change the aperture if you've got a cluster of pinholes that are all very bright, so that the pattern doesn't seem to be that lovely kind of random pattern of bright suns and less bright suns. You can change all that once you've got a photograph taken with it. It is sort of kitchen foil, but it's bought on big rolls from a manufacturer down in Devon, near to Exeter. They make foils for all kinds of industrial uses. I just choose a foil that's a bit thicker than kitchen foil. Their thicknesses are measured in microns, and I go for a certain micron that just allows the pin to go through without too much what you would call burr on the back, where the pin explodes through the back of the foil. You get these little jaggedy bits, and they're not bad things to have because they reflect a little bit of light as the solar image passes through the pinhole, and it creates a sort of halation effect. It's an amazing thing that a pinhole acts as a lens. The physics of it is difficult to understand. I mean, theoretically, you could use all of these pinholes to photograph anything you like, but you just have 25,000 versions, whereas I only use it to photograph the sun, so I never see anything but little solar images through them. This is doing the thing that my spirit needs it to do. It doesn't seem to need it to do anything else, so this is what I do with this technique. And then it moved on to the paintings. I think what's interesting about this process, looking at it now after, I don't know, 30 years since I first invented it, is that it's puncturing a metal surface. It's puncturing, as it were, the skin of the silhouette, the human being. And it's allowing light through these apertures. It makes me think that, you know, part of what the metaphor of it is that was so satisfying to me when I invented it was that it was making a barrier porous, allowing things in and out of the body through this kind of porous surface. So then there was a period of just making lots of those guest images. It felt wonderful to be able to give expression to whatever was powering the need to make those images. It was one of those moments, you know, and it lasted several years, where the doing was more important than any thinking. And so I was just doing them, enjoying that strange activity of being in the dark for an hour or so, literally in pitch black. You can't see your hand in front of your face while you're loading the camera up. When I had a bigger photo studio in the farm across the next village, the space in which I loaded up the camera was rather bigger. But if I put the tape down or a pair of scissors or something like that, I would often find myself reaching for them, having not really thought where I'd put them down, and they would just be there at my fingertips. So it was as if I'd got the sensibility of a blind person. The room was mapped in a different kind of way than a sighted person would have it. When I do switch the light off and start to unload, occasionally, because you know this studio is a barn basically, occasionally I've felt in the pitch black, and you can't see your hand in front of your face. I've felt a silent waft of air go past me, and then when I turn the light on after I've made the paper safe and put it all in the light type boxes, there's a bat flying around inside the studio. So that's a funny thing sometimes. But to be in the quiet, utter darkness for all that time, loading the camera up very methodically, and then to open that door into the blinding sunshine and wheel the camera out and allow the sun's light into the camera just for that moment, and wheel it back into the dark and spend another hour unloading it and making the paper safe ready for development. The process is incredibly analog. It's a sort of miracle that you get a clean image, you know, as you've seen. My studio is not a photographic studio with lab conditions. It's a barn with owl feathers falling from the ceiling if you're not careful. the exposure is made out in a field with sheep or cattle. So it's an incredibly hands-on experience. This way, look. Just get it in the middle. Okay, let me just tidy it up. Okay. So just take it down and put it down. So I'm going to take this off and then we're going to put the shutter on. Just this bit of it, this bit here, there you go. Just rip it if you want. Yeah, that's good. It's on as well, actually. This will be, no, that's probably the best thing, okay? Let go, let go. There's something about the hands-on, the DIY aspect to it that is really important to me. Okay. I mean, when I first made solar pictures, it was in 1991 in the Rocky Mountains in Canada. I did a residency at the Banff Centre. I wanted to do these big black suns, so like 2 meters across images of the sun. I took a telescope lens, just the glass, and an eyepiece to Canada with me, and found a plumber and I said, I want a length of pipe and we're going to nest smaller and smaller bits of pipe until it fits the eyepiece and build a telescope. And I didn't know how to build a telescope, but lo and behold, I built a telescope and used that in a barn to project this 2 meter across image of the sun onto black and white paper. So you got these big black suns that were amazing, like something out of Blake, you know, the son of hell. And I would never have wanted to take a telescope or have somebody make me a telescope. I always want to do the hands-on bit. So it's the same with this camera, which is all handmade. That's such a meditative activity, especially out here in, you know, such beautiful landscape. So that went on for some years. The first guest show was in 1993. At that point I was with this gallery called Listen Gallery, and Nicholas Logsdale, the first guests I showed him, he said, oh, let's show them in the Cologne Art Fair as part of the Listen Gallery stand. And then I had a show with them in London with the Independent Art Space, which was on the King's Road. And Paul Kasmin, from the son of John Kasmin of Kasmin and Knoedler, came from New York and saw them, and then I started to show them in New York more than anywhere else. Generating a random pattern is one of the most difficult things to do. Human beings are rarely random in reality. So we've just rolled the camera in after having made the exposure, and now we're shutting the door and we're going to be in the dark. So I'm just going to take off the white cloth that kept the camera cool while we were outside. So this is the light baffle before we put the shutter on that kept it light tight while we were rolling it out. And I'm going to take this off and then take the foil off that has the pinholes in. All of that has got to be done in pitch blackness. So, and that's the same with loading up. And I'm going to be stripping off all this tape down here in order to be able to get the foil off. Okay, so we're going dark. So this is how it comes out of the developer. So when I loaded it up, I put this sheet of paper into the camera. These silhouettes here, these photograms are of magnets that magnetize the paper down to the bottom of the camera. So that's what keeps the paper flat in the bottom of the camera, these magnets. So would I make any adjustments to this foil? I might put another couple of brighter suns into there. Yeah, there's not much wrong with that, is there? You can see with this one, so this was done at sunset on a winter's day. So the sun is, from the studio, the sun is very low on the horizon and the sky's not very bright, so the paper only sees it as black, and it records the suns as very dim, sort of dusky colours, okay? When the sun is so low on the horizon to get something as dark as this, which is what I'm after, often it's descending into the wood. So the sun's actually descending into the trees about 2 or 3 miles away from the studio. In the suns where it's gone into the trees, what happens is that each of these little suns records the tree trunks and branches of the forest that the sun is descending into. A lot of people think that, you know, these are images of the pinholes, you know, that somehow the pinhole makes this little round circle. Whereas it's not. Every single one of the pinholes makes a little image of the sun's disk. I started to gather a group of people together who were going to be in this Yehezkel guest. And I didn't question why it was I was asking certain people until maybe 3 years in, when I started to think, what links these people? It was at that point that I suddenly realized they are significant to me, and most of them are significant enough to be part of my dream activity at night. And that then suddenly made me realize what I'm doing is making a kind of self-portrait, because everybody in your friendship group, you have some psychic connection to them, which is based on either likeness or people who are unlike you. And that reading backwards and forwards between those people gives you a lot of information about the psyche that you contain. And even more significant when they are in your dreams. Everybody in your dreams are not only themselves, they're partly themselves, but they're mainly an aspect of your own being that your dream creating part of your psyche has screen grabbed in another person to represent that part of the inside of you. Then the group started to get really interesting, because I started to think, wow, this person here who I'm extremely friendly with, or this person here that I have problems with, and they all were becoming part of the group. And you could see yourself in that. But then after a little while, I started to think, okay, when they come into the group, there's something about the nature of the guest series where they basically just stand and they're saying something about being just by being, rather than being in an action. So this was made in February. Again, it's a Venetian picture. This was made at 5:19 p.m. on the 16th of February 1997. So that's close to sunset in February. The sun will be virtually on the horizon at that point. And so when the sun's on the horizon, obviously it's dimmer because it's going through the layers of Venetian mist. So each of the little suns is a duskier, orangier colour, but the paper can't really cope with the fact that the sky is less light. So the paper doesn't really record the sky. So you get this sort of dark effect. It's almost a nighttime scene, doesn't it? But it's not. So this is the daughter of our friend in Venice. She was called Jessie. So you can see what I was talking about in terms of making the feeling of volume in the body, because these bright suns are the full width of the pin barrel, and then these darker suns and the ones that are used for her hair here are just the tiniest nick of the tip of the pin, which makes a less focused sun and a slightly darker sun, and they seem to recede psychologically into the background, and these ones, the bright ones, seem closer to you, so you get that nice feeling of volume in the body. You could make it very flat. If you made every pinhole the same, or pricked through the foil to the full width of the barrel of the pin, every pinhole would be the same width. The aperture would be exactly the same, and it would produce a field of bright suns, which would seem all to be in the same plane. Oh, it drives you nuts. Because it takes a week or more to do one of those foils. In order to make the day pass whilst you're doing it, I listen to music. But if I listen to Sibelius in the morning and then Led Zeppelin in the afternoon, the quality of the pinhole field changes. And then you get a part of the figure that's like, ah, and then a very serene part. You've got to have the same relaxed state through the whole thing to give that feeling of randomness. That's a very carefully created randomness. Yeah, I'm not knocking it. It's a lovely thing to do because you're not thinking about anything. You're literally just being. And, yeah, that's a delight, isn't it? The very first solar pinhole things were done in 1991, and they were black and white, and they were made in that Meteor cooler box in 1991. And then I converted to doing them in colour, and they were just the colour clusters. And by 93, then I'd asked my father to build me the big 10/8 actual 30 by 40 dark slide, and so I could start doing life-size figures. And at that point, Sue and I both quit our jobs. Sue was working for what used to be the BBC Picture Library. I was working at the V&A, and we quit and we moved to Venice as a romantic thing to do. And that move coincided with the beginning of the guest series. That was the sort of leading cusp of where I was at that point. And so we transported the big cameras to Venice by ship. We flew when we moved, so we had a few weeks whilst the stuff was arriving, and we took our furniture. You know, it was crazy. One day I got word that a barge was coming from the docks with the big cameras on, driven by a fantastic old boatman called Gigi, docked at our canal, and we unloaded the big cameras. Then I had almost 2 years making guests in Venice, which was fantastic because the atmosphere there, the golden light of the sunset on the lagoon, all the rest of it, times of day make a variety of different colours with the guest. It was bonkers because Venice is packed, and so the best time of day to work is when everybody's having a siesta. So I would get the cameras out of the studio and do them on the canal side outside the studio if the sun was high. Obviously you've got the buildings, so you need the sun to be high in order to be able to do it near the studio. But if I wanted a low sun which gives you a much richer orangey guest and with a darker sky in it, then we would take the cameras to the lagoon side, the seafront as it were, which involved carrying them up and down endless bridges over the canals. And the locals used to think we were the mad English people who were toiling with this huge block of wood, which, calling that thing a camera is slightly ennobling it, isn't it? It's basically a packing crate, with the solar foil on the top of it. Sue was helping me every time we did it. And I started to think, well, in my dreams, they interact. You could do all sorts of things with the guests. In the early days, I tried it where, I had this massive camera that was 2.5 times as big as that big one we filmed, where you can have multiple figures. And I would have multiple figures interacting with each other as a kind of, limbering up to try and get them to do the same things as significant people do in the dreams. And there was a moment in the late 90s when I thought, okay, let's get them together, the guests together. Let's treat them as actors. And I started to make videos. Some of the people who had been in the guest series acted in videos. The film, which was called Fusion, but spelt as it is in the dictionary, and that was the beginning of me wanting the guests to actually act out a story and to kind of daydream as a story of how they would interact into being. They were narrative films with a story and a plot and costume, and just like a play. Acting out things that were not from the dreams, but from this parallel world. The studio world of making things is a kind of daydream for me. I set them in motion within this kind of daydream rather than a night dream. That was satisfying, but there was something inappropriate about it. It wasn't appropriate to the subject matter. The fact that I was filming and I was costume designing, making costumes, sewing costumes, designing the jewellery that they wore. There were very symbolic jewels in some of them, goldsmiths and pearl merchants, and getting in the materials and all the rest of it. All that was very enjoyable, but it was a different kind of hands-on than something in me needed. So the hands-on of cutting a dress or the hands-on of creating a maquette for a piece of jewellery, I needed touching paper or touching canvas with a brush or a pencil or a piece of charcoal. And the act of touching was missing from the filmmaking activity. For some reason, that was what I needed. I needed touch. And so I started to turn the little drawings that I'd done to storyboard the videos that were using the guest people. I started to turn those little drawings into more ornate drawings, and then it turned into the paintings. And so it's the guest figures in the drawings and the paintings, but in a different medium and fully engaging with each other in a play. So the play seems rather, at the time that you're daydreaming it into being, it seems rather difficult to understand it. And yet if you step back after a year of doing it, 2 years of doing it, 10 years of doing it, whatever, it adds up into a really coherent narrative that you didn't know that you were creating. So that's how I got to the paintings. But just to return to the big photographs with the multiple figures, there's something about those that wasn't quite right, and I eventually returned to making them just as single figures. There's something about the guests as single figures standing there saying, "This is me, I am my being, here I am," plain and simple. That is the essence of them. So I've reverted to just doing those. Some of the ones from the period when I was beginning to think about setting them into a play and having them interact, I would create overlapping figures. So there's one which is of me. I'm looking in one direction and I'm looking in another direction, and the part of my body overlaps, just the way the foil is. I am often in two minds about things, so that was quite a significant way of portraying myself, but it's not really the simplicity of the single figure. Somehow I return to all the time, and I've abandoned those complicated ones with many figures. That part of what I need to do and be is taken care of in the paintings anyway, because I have as many figures as I can put in the paintings. The shift between media, I mentioned making paintings before the guests, and then shifting into the guests, never feels like an identity shift. It just feels like some necessary evolution, I suppose. They feel inevitable. All these pictures that we're looking at in the book, the earlier things before the guests, these are the kind of things that I was doing during the jailbreak. How the whole kind of view of nature was transformed in me. During that period, I was making these works. These are the works that sort of delineate the trajectory. So there was this one of the dianthus, which is a cross between a British dianthus, the cheddar pink, which grows only on the Cheddar Gorge, I think. And I took the pollen from the cheddar pinks and pollinated a modern, highly bred, you know, gone through 500 years since the Renaissance, variety of carnation, which is the product of breeding dianthus. And so that became this Dianthus Chris Eubank. And so it was a cross between a highly natural version of the carnation, the Dianthus from the Cheddar Gorge, and the modern one that had, you know, amazing modern names like Telstar and stuff like that. So that was a genetic splice. So that was pollination between an ancient species and a modern version of that species. So there was a kind of gene splice going on. It was a breeding thing. So the other things that I was doing at this time in the early 90s was actually grafting things together, like, you know, plumbers join things. So this one is a pear tree branches grafted on to a hawthorn stem and trunk and root system. So what you got was a tree that in the autumn had pears on it, as well as those little red haw-berries that you get on hawthorn trees. So it was a sort of grafted hybrid, as it were. So the very first ones were these hyacinths. So they were Hyacinthus orientalis Delft blue. So it was a hyacinth that had been bred in Holland, where plant breeding has been going on for, you know, 500 years or so. So it's something that was highly bred from a very natural single-flowered hyacinth, like the sort of thing that you see in Turkish tiles and things like that, and bred to have this amazing blue multi-flowered head. It was very influenced by human activity, its whole breeding over those 500 years. And I went out and planted those in a natural setting in a national park, which, you know, was talking about the idea of human design as a natural phenomenon in nature, really, I suppose. The other film is the giant camera that was built in Cornwall. So the whole point of this giant camera was that you could go into it and visit it, and that there was a live guest appearing on a sheet of muslin that was suspended from the ceiling, and it kind of wafted as you walked past it. All the blue guests are just natural colour. It's the sky, and also the darker ones with the dusky suns. They're all natural. But any other colour, like the yellows or the reds or the greens, they're made with these gels. So these are gels from the film industry. These are the gels that the lighting people would put over big lighting rigs in film studios in order to create different lighting effects, or maybe in theatres as well. Epic, beautiful colours. So I only need a strip. You know, for that shutter, I'd just be cutting off, you know, an inch, 2 inches maybe. It's the way they overlap that I find fascinating. See the world through rose-tinted spectacles. What's weird is your eyes get used to it. You know, if you put these on your glasses for half a day, your brain converts the red information into normal daylight.
Yeah.